The screaming had stopped. Now there was only the wind. Somewhere behind the ridge, a horse gave a sharp snort followed by silence. The boy lay flat beneath the brush, heart pounding so loud he feared it might give him away. He could still smell the smoke from the wagons, still see the twisted shape of his mother's shawl flapping in the dirt beside a broken wheel. A boot was nearby, not hers. A man's, turned the wrong way. He didn't know if he was the only one left alive. He didn't even know if the Comanche were still here, but they were. They always waited. They were hunters first and warriors second, and they enjoyed the silence after the killing. And as you listen now, maybe you're far from that wind and dust, perhaps in Austin stirring your morning coffee, or in Denver, sitting quietly with headphones as the city slows for the night, or maybe in London, lying back and letting these stories carry you somewhere older than time itself. Wherever you are, the echoes of that world still reach you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you want to keep exploring the real stories behind the frontier, subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, back to the clearing. That was when they listened for breath, when they watched the grass, when they dragged the flat end of a lance through the dust waiting for a flinch, when they found you. The boy moved, just a twitch, and from the edge of the clearing a painted horse stepped forward. On it sat a man with streaks of red across his chest. He did not shout. He only pointed down. Then others appeared. The capture was swift. There were no questions, no words exchanged. They bound his wrists with rawhide and stripped him of his shirt and shoes. Then they tied a rope around his neck, not tight enough to choke, but short enough that any fool would drag him. He wasn't alone. Along the trail 2 more had been taken. One was a woman in a torn calico dress. The other was a man, still bleeding from the shoulder, who could barely walk. The Comanche warriors showed no concern. They moved with practiced precision, checking weapons, circling their horses, watching the hills. Each captive was a prize, or a message. Whether you lived or died depended on who had lost what in the last raid. If a warrior's brother had fallen, you might be his replacement, or his revenge. The boy did not yet understand this. All he knew was the heat of the sun on his back, the pull of the rope and the sound of hoofbeats behind him. He looked back once. The man with the painted chest was still watching. He said nothing. But there was something in his eyes that said, this was only the beginning. Comanche raids were not chaotic skirmishes. They were fast, efficient and tactical. Warriors struck in small units, usually before dawn, often from the rear or the flanks. Their goal was surprise, not siege. They had no interest in drawn-out fights. When the shooting started, the outcome was already decided. Horses were their advantage. Each rider knew how to hang off the side with only a leg over the saddle, firing from underneath a galloping mustang. They could kill, disarm, or capture in seconds. Settlers often mistook them for more numerous than they were. In truth, a single band could wipe out an entire camp with fewer than 20 men. When they attacked, there were usually 2 targets: supplies and captives, especially if the captives could serve a purpose. Young children were preferred alive. Women were sometimes spared for barter or use. Men, especially fighting age, were dangerous to keep but too valuable to waste, at least at first. The decision came later. By midday the raiding party would be gone. The fires would still be smouldering. The dead would remain behind, and the living, those chosen, would be led east or south, blindfolded or not. There was no pattern. As the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline, the terrain changed. Open plains gave way to rougher ground, dry creek beds, thorned brush, scattered stone. The prisoners struggled to keep pace. Their captors didn't look back. If someone fell, they were dragged. If they screamed, they were silenced with the butt of a lance. The boy stumbled once and was yanked so hard he struck a rock with his jaw. Blood filled his mouth. Still he walked. There was no choice. The Comanche didn't waste time with instructions. They didn't explain the rules. They let pain teach. Occasionally one warrior would ride close, not to speak but to stare, to measure. It was unclear what he was looking for: strength, weakness, a reason to kill or a reason to keep. There were stories of men being killed on the first day just to set an example. Others were marked with cuts or burns. Sometimes the youngest captives were treated gently, but not always. As dusk settled, the group stopped near a line of boulders. No fire was made. The captives were tied together at the ankles and left in the open. Above, vultures circled. Below, the night waited. That first night was the longest. The temperature dropped quickly. Without shoes or coats, the captives curled in the dirt, their arms bound behind their backs. Sleep was impossible. Any movement brought the tug of the rawhide or the jab of a boot. The warriors spoke little. They chewed dried meat, passed a water bladder between them, and kept watch in shifts. One urinated near the prisoners without a glance. Another cleaned blood from his blade with a strip of someone's clothing. These were men raised on war, trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill. Mercy was not expected. Pity was not part of the culture. The boy watched the stars overhead, too scared to cry. His jaw ached, and the blood had dried down his neck. Somewhere behind him the older man coughed once, then went quiet. The woman muttered prayers under her breath until a warrior silenced her with a kick. No one else spoke. In the silence, fear took shape. Not just fear of pain, but fear of not knowing. What would happen tomorrow? Who would still be alive? What did they want? And why, above all else, hadn't they already killed them? By first light the march had begun. No words were spoken to the captives. The ropes were untied from the boulders, only to be fastened into a longer lead that connected wrist to wrist, neck to neck. The pace was steady, not rushed, but it did not stop. Each captive was expected to walk without help, regardless of wounds, thirst, or exhaustion. Warriors rode beside them, switching positions every hour. A few dismounted to lead extra horses. These were not just animals, they were currency. Raided stock, proof of victory and future trade. The group moved across scrubland and prairie, following routes known only to the Comanche. Occasionally a rider would gallop ahead to scout. Others watched the sky. This was not just about avoiding pursuers. It was about keeping the captives afraid, off balance, and uncertain of direction. The woman's feet bled by mid-morning. The boy's legs shook. The older man had fallen behind and been struck twice already. Still, no one was killed. That was important. At this stage, the prisoners were alive for a reason. Whether that reason was ransom, ritual, or revenge, none of them could guess. So they walked, mile after mile. The sun was at its highest when the group reached a narrow arroyo. Here, the lead captive, the older man, collapsed for the third time. This time, a warrior dismounted. He did not speak. He cut the man loose from the line, stepped back, and waited. The others, still bound, could only turn their heads. The man tried to rise. He got to his knees, then fell again. There was no shouting, no anger, just one blow. The edge of a stone war club across the skull. It made a short, flat sound. The man slumped forward and did not move again. The warrior wiped the club clean on the dirt, took the man's belt knife, and returned to his horse. The body was left where it fell. The march resumed. No one spoke. Even among the Comanche there was a lesson in this, not for the dead, but for those still walking. From that point forward, the boy no longer looked behind him. He focused only on the rope in front of him, the dust beneath his feet, and the pain in his legs. The desert gave nothing freely. Neither did the people who ruled it. By afternoon, the terrain began to rise. Low hills formed uneven shadows across the trail. The captives were forced to climb in silence, their knees buckling on loose rock and dry roots. Occasionally, the warriors would strike the ground with a lance tip, not to wound, but to signal urgency. The group had travelled nearly 20 miles since sunrise. No food had been offered. Only one sip of water had been allowed, passed from a horn flask that smelled of leather and iron. The woman's eyes were swollen from sun and dust. She no longer cried. The boy's lips were cracked, and he could taste blood in his mouth again. Still, they moved forward. This was a test, but not of strength alone. Comanche warriors believed endurance revealed spirit. If a captive broke down too quickly, they might be discarded, or saved for later punishment. If one survived too well, they might be marked for something more. But until camp was reached, nothing was certain. Even the warriors said little. Their focus was outward, toward the land, the sky, the movement of birds. To them, this trail was not a punishment. It was simply protocol. As the sun dipped low again, the captives caught their first glimpse of the main camp. It wasn't what they expected. No palisades, no great fires, no distant howls. Just a scattering of hide teepees set along a small creek, half hidden by cottonwood trees. Children played in the mud near the water. Dogs barked, then retreated. Women looked up from their work and stared. Some paused while scraping hides or gathering brush. One elder squinted and spat. No one spoke to the captives, but they were watched. Eyes followed their every movement as they entered the centre of the camp. There, a group of older men waited beside 3 upright poles set into the ground. These were not mistreat stakes, not yet, but they signalled judgment. The captives were untied and made to sit cross-legged on the dirt. Warriors stepped back. One older Comanche approached and began speaking in a low voice. The words were not translated. The boy could not understand, but he knew it mattered. One by one, the captives were examined. Arms lifted, teeth checked, bruises noted. The people of the camp were not angry. They were curious and waiting to see what came next. That night, fires were lit in a wide ring. Not large, but enough to cast long shadows across the camp. The captives were tied again, this time to single wooden stakes near the edge of the gathering. They were not alone. Around them, families sat in silence. Elders smoked. Warriors sharpened knives with bone tools. The children had been sent away. The air was filled with the scent of smoke, sweat, and boiled meat. The boy's stomach ached, but no food was offered. The woman sat beside him, her hands trembling. She whispered a name, perhaps a prayer or a memory. Across the fire, the older Comanche who had examined them earlier now stood. In his hand was a long stick with black markings. He spoke again, calmly, pointing once at the boy, once at the woman. A murmur passed through the crowd. It was clear something had been decided. One warrior nodded and stood. Another stepped away and disappeared into the dark. The boy could feel eyes on him, but no one moved. Then, suddenly, a burst of shrill cries erupted, not from anger, but from ritual. Somewhere in the dark, a drum began to beat. At sunrise, the chosen captive was untied from the stake. It was the man taken earlier with the wounded shoulder, the one who had survived the march but spoken no words. He was stripped to the waist and brought to the centre of the camp. The villagers formed a circle. Children were kept back. Women stood in silence. A warrior stepped forward with a knife, not to kill, but to mark. He dragged the blade across the captive's chest, shallow but deliberate, just beneath the collarbone. Blood welled instantly. This was not done in anger. It was methodical. The Comanche believed pain was a test of truth, of spirit. A captive who screamed too soon was weak. One who endured gained a strange form of respect, even in death. The cuts continued, arms, legs, across the back. Ash was rubbed into the wounds to keep them open. Then came fire. A stick was heated in the coals and pressed against the man's skin, again and again, each time in a different place. His face contorted. He did not beg. The warriors said nothing. The crowd simply watched. In this place, suffering had a purpose. It made the dead speak. When the skinning began, it was not done in full, and not all at once. The warrior selected for the task used a blade of sharpened bone, honed thin and kept clean. He began at the lower leg, peeling a section behind the calf no larger than a handprint. The man convulsed. Blood ran freely. Women nearby turned their heads but did not leave. This was not just punishment, it was demonstration. To the Comanche, the ritual served multiple functions: justice for lost kin, warning to enemies, and a ceremony of passage for young warriors. Some were allowed to watch closely to learn, others were told only to observe. The pain was real, but it was also a lesson. Each wound spoke of a raid, a brother lost, a village burned. The captive became a symbol, not of the enemy's power, but of their defeat. After each cut, the man was given time to breathe, sometimes even water, not out of mercy, but to prolong the ritual. His screams echoed beyond the camp. No one stopped it. No one spoke against it. Here, on the southern plains, torture was not chaos. It was structured, and it was remembered. As the sun moved overhead, the ritual changed. The captive's arms were stretched and tied to a wooden frame. Not a cross, but a horizontal beam lashed between 2 forked posts. His feet remained free, scraping at the dirt with each spasm. More warriors approached. One carried a pouch of sharpened flint chips. Another brought a bundle of greenwood rods, flexible and wet. What followed was slow. The flint was used to slice into the man's thighs, just below the skin. The rods were heated at one end, then snapped against the open wounds. It was not a frenzy. Each strike had rhythm. Some wounds were reopened. Others were carved anew. His face swelled, his breath came in gasps, and yet they let him live. This was not to make him talk. They already knew what they needed. It was to make him suffer in public, for everyone to see. For every young warrior who might one day be captured, it was a warning. For every elder who had lost a son, it was a moment of justice, and for the captive himself it was the final undoing of name, of strength, and eventually of flesh. As dusk neared, the final phase began. A small pit was dug, not deep, just wide enough to hold the lower legs. The man was placed inside it, upright, still tied to the cross frame. Dry sagebrush was piled around his knees. The crowd gathered again, this time in greater numbers. There was no speech. A single flame was passed from hand to hand until it reached the eldest warrior present. He lit the fire himself. Smoke rose first, thick, choking. The captive coughed, twisted, then screamed as the flames caught on the edges of his clothes and into the open cuts. The smell of burned flesh spread quickly. But they did not feed the fire. It was kept low, slow burning, so that the pain would climb by inches. When the man passed out, a warrior tossed cold water over him. Not to revive, to prolong. This was the Comanche way of execution for those who had brought great harm. It was not random. It was reserved. Warriors did not do this for amusement. They did it to remember. And when it was over, the fire was put out. His body was left where it had burned, unburied. That night, no drums were played. No victory songs were sung. The camp was quiet. Some warriors sat alone, sharpening blades or tending to horses. Others returned to their teepees without a word. Among the younger men, a few whispered about what they had seen, what the captive had endured, and how long he had lasted. For those who had taken part, there was no celebration, just reflection. Pain was part of the cycle, just like drought or war. It taught, it warned, it restored balance. The boy, still tied to his stake, had not looked away once. He had seen every part of it. The woman beside him had closed her eyes long ago and had not reopened them. No one touched them. No one spoke to them. They had been kept alive, for now. But they knew what the fire meant. They knew what would happen if they failed to endure. In Comanche, belief to die without resistance was shameful. But to survive long enough to be remembered, that was something else. That night, as the wind moved across the flat earth, the only thing that remained of the dead man was the scent of smoke. The morning after the execution, the captives who remained alive were untied. Not freed, but repositioned. The boy and the woman were led to opposite sides of the camp and placed near separate teepees. Around them, daily life resumed. Women ground corn on flat stones. Men prepared weapons and saddles. Children returned to play. No one explained anything to the captives. They were given no water, no food. But they were not struck. This marked a shift. In Comanche practice, not every captive was meant to die. Some were absorbed, temporarily or permanently. The process began without warning. A warrior's family might claim a child to replace a lost son. A woman might be taken as labour or traded. A man, if not executed, might face months of servitude or be used as leverage in negotiations. What determined survival was not kindness, it was usefulness. The boy was small and quiet. The woman, though bruised, could walk. These facts mattered, and so they were watched, not harmed. A girl no older than 10 placed a small clay bowl of water beside the boy. She didn't speak. Then she walked away. That was how it started, quietly. By midday, the boy had been taken to a group of older women. One examined his hands and arms, then pointed to a pile of firewood. He understood. He began to work. Each log he carried was small, but the task was endless. Around him, Comanche women gave commands through gesture. When he slowed, they clapped once sharp and loud. He was not beaten, but he was never allowed to stop. The woman captive, meanwhile, was ordered to scrape hides near the creek. Her work was watched by a warrior seated nearby. She used a dull stone scraper and a piece of antler. The skin was stiff and heavy. Her fingers bled. Still, she worked. In Comanche society, captives were evaluated by what they could endure. Weakness was remembered. So was defiance. But obedience could be useful, even profitable. Some captives were traded north to the Cheyenne, or east toward traders near Mexican outposts. Others remained for years, A few became wives, fewer still became trusted, but most lived between those fates, never fully free, never fully family. The boy didn't know this. He only knew his legs ached, and the warriors had stopped watching him. For now. Weeks passed. The boy learned to carry water, gather wood, and care for the horses. He spoke little, listened much, and began to understand a few words. Hunger taught him faster than fear. When he obeyed quickly, food came sooner. When he worked silently, blows were fewer. One of the women, older, with grey streaks in her hair, began to feed him from her own bowl. She spoke to him softly, though he understood nothing. Over time, she gave him a new name, short and simple. He didn't know its meaning, but the others began to use it too. Among the Comanche, naming was not mercy. It was ownership. A name meant he now belonged to someone. At night, he slept outside her lodge, wrapped in a hide. The same warriors who once guarded him now ignored him. The woman captive still laboured by the creek. Sometimes she looked up and saw him watching. Neither spoke. Each day followed the same rhythm: work, eat, rest. The sounds of laughter and horses filled the camp again. For the Comanche, the war was over. For the captives, it had only changed form. Survival was no longer about escaping, it was about becoming. In Comanche camps, captives were not chained. Escape was discouraged through distance and fear, not walls. The plains stretched endlessly in all directions, and those who ran rarely returned. Some were hunted down, others vanished into the land, their bones never found. Yet a few stayed willingly. Children adapted fastest. Within months they learned to ride bareback, to speak the language, to mimic customs. The boy, now dressed in a deerskin shirt, had begun to forget certain words from before. When he laughed, it sounded different. The woman did not change as quickly. She still worked apart, still kept her distance. Sometimes she sang softly in her own tongue. No one stopped her, but no one joined in. She was tolerated, not accepted. Some captives like her would be ransomed years later if traders or soldiers paid enough. Others would die before such a chance arrived. For the Comanche, holding captives had always been part of the cycle: trade, war, and replacement. For the captives, it was a test of endurance without an end date. Every sunrise meant they had survived another day. Every sunset reminded them they were still not free. That night, as the camp settled under a wide sky, the boy lay beside the dying embers of a small fire. He could hear the low hum of voices from nearby teepees, the stamping of horses, the bark of distant coyotes. The air smelled of smoke and sweat. The woman sat across the camp, her hands bound loosely with rope as she slept upright. The stars above were sharp and countless. Somewhere beyond them, he imagined the world he'd come from. A cabin, a voice calling his name, a dog barking in the yard. But the memory was fading. He touched the beaded cord now tied around his wrist. A mark of belonging. It meant something to them. It meant something to him, too, though he didn't yet know what. Among the Comanche, captives could become kin, slaves, or stories. The line between them was thin. The boy had crossed it without realizing. The woman had not. As the fire's glow dimmed, a warrior walked past, glanced at the boy, and nodded once. It was not approval. It was acknowledgement. The smallest sign that he would live to see another day. That was enough. Years later, those who survived Comanche captivity rarely told their stories the same way. Some spoke of cruelty, of fire, knives, and silence. Others remembered the quiet routines, the faces that fed them, the words they learned by necessity. But across nearly every account, one element remained constant: fear. Not just fear of death, but fear of being forgotten, of becoming something else. For settlers who escaped, the experience left a scar deeper than physical pain. When they returned, they were often changed, in speech, behaviour, even dress. Some were rejected by their communities. Others were used as examples, paraded as survivors of savagery. The line between fact and myth blurred quickly. Newspapers spread stories of skinning, burning, and children turned into warriors. Some were true, others were not. But they served a purpose: to justify war, to erase nuance, and to warn others of what lay beyond the frontier. For the Comanche, these acts were rooted in order, tradition, and vengeance. For the settlers, they became legend, and in time, legend became history. Around fire pits and frontier forts, people spoke of what happened to those taken alive and what it cost to survive. These stories did more than frighten. They shaped decisions. Army commanders cited them in reports. Indian agents referenced them in letters. Even US presidents repeated phrases drawn from captivity tales. Stories of innocent families destroyed, of heroic escapes, of unimaginable torture. Whether true or not, these accounts influenced policy. Treaties were broken. Retaliations escalated. Militias rode with the memory of burned settlers and stolen children etched into their minds. For settlers still living near Comanche territory, the fear was constant. They fortified homes, trained with rifles, and kept watch at night. Some moved east. Others joined ranger units. Captivity was not just a risk. It was seen as a fate worse than death. Mothers begged to be shot before capture. Men carried pistols with a single bullet saved. The power of the Comanche, long feared for their raids and horsemanship, was amplified through these stories. In time, even tribes that had little contact with them were lumped into the same fear. The frontier no longer saw individuals, it saw shadows, wild, merciless, and waiting. The line between truth and terror faded, and in that space the Comanche lived, not only as warriors, but as warnings. Among other tribes, the reputation of the Comanche spread just as quickly. Apache, Kiowa, and Ute captives spoke of the same punishments, the same relentless pace of raids and marches. Even hardened enemies approached Comanche territory with caution. Captivity in this region was unlike the forms practiced elsewhere. Among eastern tribes, captives were often ransomed or adopted, but on the southern plains, vengeance was central. The Comanche measured loss by blood and answered it with pain. Still, there were moments of exception. A captured child spared, a woman released, a young man taken into the tribe and later made a warrior. These were not contradictions. They were part of the same structure. The Comanche world was built on balance. For every act of cruelty, there was a place for adoption. For every execution, a reason. Outsiders often misunderstood this. What they saw as savagery, the Comanche saw as justice. What they labelled as chaos, the Comanche called order. But over time, only the brutality was remembered. The nuance faded. In books, in speeches, and in memory, the captors became monsters. And in doing so, the people who once lived, hunted, and judged by their own rules were turned into something else entirely. In later years, some former captives returned to visit the plains where they had once been held. Some found burial mounds, others found nothing. The camps were long gone, teepees taken down, trails covered, names forgotten. But a few landmarks remained. A bent cottonwood tree, a dry creek bed, the stones where a fire had once burned. These visitors, now old, rarely spoke aloud. They looked, paused, then moved on. Some left small tokens behind. Beads, scraps of cloth, bits of carved wood. Not in forgiveness, just in memory. For many, survival had come at a price. Silence. Their stories were told only once, or not at all. But the land remembered. The wind still moved across the same empty spaces, and somewhere, beneath the soil, traces remained. Of blood, of ash, of steps taken in fear. The Comanche themselves had changed by then, confined to reservations, their power broken, their horses gone. But the memory of what they had done, and what had been done to them, lingered in the edges of maps and the margins of family stories. Captivity had ended, but its shadow stretched further than any trail. Now more than a century later, the stories still echo. In oral histories, in old journals, in museum records. Fragments of what it was like to be taken. Some accounts are graphic, others are distant, stripped of detail by time. But together, they form a map of memory, brutal, incomplete, and undeniably human. To be captured by the Comanche was to enter a different world, a world ruled by pain, by ritual, by survival, and also sometimes by strange forms of mercy. Not all captives died, not all were broken. Some adapted, some resisted, some were never truly seen again. The legacy they left behind is not one of heroes or villains. It is one of endurance, of what people will do to survive, and what others will do to remember. The fire pits are cold now, the rawhide ropes have long since rotted, but the questions remain. What would you have done if they had pointed to you, if they had spared you, if they had tested you? The answers lie not in books, but in the long silence that followed, when the screaming stopped and the wind returned. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.